Okay, let's unpack this. We're diving deep into just an absolutely epic rivalry from the ancient world. Rome versus Carthage.
Yeah.
This wasn't just some minor squabble. This was, a clash of titans that really shaped the Mediterranean. And right at the heart of it, well, one of its most dramatic periods is the legendary figure of Hannibal.
Right. And the source material we're looking at for this deep dive, it gives us a really detailed, almost like a blow-by-blow account of this massive conflict, the Punic Wars. It sort of takes us on this journey, focusing particularly on Hannibal's incredible story from the start, really, all the way through to the bitter end.
It's fascinating because, these weren't exactly new kids on the block bumping into each other.
No, not at all.
Both Rome and Carthage have been growing for, something like 500 years?
Yeah.
Slowly expanding their influence, kind of on opposite sides of the sea. Looking back now, their collision almost feels, well, inevitable, doesn't it? Like it was just bound to happen.
Exactly. And what our source really brings out is just how fundamentally different these two powers were. So our mission here for this deep dive is to kind of cut through the chronology and pull out the really compelling stories, the surprising facts, understand the key turning points, and meet the individuals who drove this whole thing. What are the nuggets that help you understand what this ancient clash was really about?
Absolutely. We're going to explore those core differences between the cultures, follow Hannibal's daring, maybe even insane, journey across continents and mountains.
Oh, yeah.
Witness those pivotal battles, meet the Roman figures who finally managed to stand up to him, and really grapple with the harsh fate of Carthage in the end.
Okay, so let's jump right into the contenders. First up, Carthage. The account describes their origins, links them to wanderers from Tyre, and their absolute focus: commerce and maritime power. They were traders, explorers, fundamentally.
Big time.
Yeah.
And they built incredible wealth from it. The source really emphasizes their control over those Spanish mines, which were hugely profitable.
Huge.
They even founded a city there in Spain just for this new Carthage, modern Carthagena. They brought in skilled engineers specifically for the mines. It just underlines that Carthaginian drive for enterprise, for generating wealth.
And the source, it describes their national character with terms like sagacity, which, their rivals, the Romans, often saw as just cunning along with activity, enterprise, and, of course, their famous wealth. It even gives us these wonderful specific details about their military, like the Balearic Islanders, these amazing sling throwers.
Oh, the slingers. That detail is incredible. Apparently, the name Balearic itself comes from a Greek word, balen, meaning to throw with a sling.
Right.
And the story goes that mothers on the islands would hang their sons' breakfast bread up high in trees, making them practice with their slings from a young age just to get their food.
Talk about motivation, a pretty unique form of military training, I'd say.
Def-
Now, Rome, in stark contrast, is described as starting quite differently. More grounded, agricultural, maybe less outward-looking at the very beginning. Founded, the story goes, by wanderers from Troy, growing steadily with this sort of internal principle of life and energy, focused on farming, raising flocks.
So you got the seagoing traders versus the land-based farmers, basically.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And their character traits, as described in the source, they couldn't be more different. Rome is defined by firmness, energy, force, both physical and mental genius, courage, strength, and this absolutely indomitable resolution. These things became almost the definition of what it meant to be Roman.
So just imagine these two forces, this mercantile dynamic sea power and this grounded, incredibly resolute land power, both expanding for 5 centuries. That collision across the Mediterranean.
Yeah, it wasn't just likely, it really felt inevitable. And that's exactly what happened. It kicked off the First Punic War. The conflict sparked right there in that narrow Strait of Messina, the water between Sicily and Italy,
Yeah.
specifically around the towns of Messina on the Sicilian side and Rhegium on the Italian side.
And this is where you see that Roman determination just leaps out. The source recounts their absolutely astonishing effort to build a navy practically from scratch.
Yeah, Rome wasn't a major naval power before this.
Right. But they found a wrecked Carthaginian galley, washed ashore, used it as a template, and basically reverse engineered an entire fleet.
It's incredible, really.
And not only did they build the ship super fast, like 100 galleys in just a couple of months, but they also had to train the crews. The source mentions them training the oarsmen on land, sitting on benches set up like they were on deck, practicing the rowing motions before they even got on a real ship.
That's Roman pragmatism for you, sheer willpower. And their big innovation to counter the Carthaginian skill at sea was the grappling iron, the corvus. It was this heavy gangplank with a big spike on the end mounted on the bow. When they got close to an enemy ship, boom, they'd drop it. It would pierce the enemy deck, locking the ships together.
Right. The whole idea was to basically cancel out the Carthaginian ship's better maneuverability and turn a sea battle into a hand-to-hand fight, like a land battle on floating platform.
Exactly.
And the source frames this as pure Roman courage. They weren't building the corvus to help them escape, but to stop the enemy from getting away. That's that indomitable resolution again.
Yeah, but despite these efforts, that first war was a real grinding struggle. The source talks about the Roman campaign in Africa led by Regulus. He actually had some significant successes early on, really pushed Carthage hard.
But then Carthage brought in reinforcements, experienced Greek mercenaries under a skilled general, and they used war elephants, which the Romans hadn't quite figured out how to counter effectively yet.
Right, and Regulus was defeated and captured.
And the story of Regulus. Wow. It's one of the most striking from this whole period.
Definitely. The Carthaginians, in a move that probably seemed clever at the time but totally backfired, sent him back to Rome to propose peace terms and a prisoner exchange. But first, they made him swear an oath that he'd return to Carthage if the mission failed.
And the source says Regulus, even though everyone, his family included, was begging him to stay, he argued passionately against accepting the terms to the Roman Senate. Said it wasn't in Rome's best interest.
What makes it so powerful is that the Romans apparently released him from his oath, said it was taken under duress, didn't count, but Regulus, he stuck to his word, refused, wouldn't even see his family again before he left. He went back to Carthage knowing full well what was waiting for him.
A really grim fate. The source describes the Carthaginians furious at his defiance, torturing him horribly before he died. It's a stark reminder of, well, honor and revenge in the ancient world.
So the first war finally ends, but the treaty terms, ironically, kind of sowed the seeds for the second conflict. The river Iberus, the Ebro in modern Spain, was set as the boundary for Carthaginian influence.
Crucially, though, the treaty also said that Saguntum, a city south of the Ebro line, so technically in Carthaginian territory, was an ally of Rome and under Roman protection.
Exactly, and that city became the flashpoint, the spark that ignited the next war.
And leading the charge on the Carthaginian side this time was Hannibal Barca, driven by this fierce ambition to get back at Rome. An ambition he seems to have passed directly down, almost like an inheritance, to his son Hannibal.
Oh, absolutely. Hannibal embodied that ambition. His siege of Saguntum was a clear, undeniable violation of the treaty, a direct challenge to Rome. You couldn't ignore it.
The Saguntines fought back like crazy, though. And the source describes one of their weapons, the philerica. This was a javelin, but a terrifying one. Well, it had this long iron point, and near the tip, they'd wrap tows soaked in, like pitch or something flammable. They'd light it and throw it, often from siege engines. As it flew, the wind fanned the flames. When it hit a shield, the spike was designed to embed really deeply, and because it was burning, the soldier couldn't pull it out easily. They often had to just drop their shield because it was literally on fire. Wow. That's a nasty piece of ancient engineering.
You bet.
Back in Carthage, though, Hannibal's aggression caused a major political split. The source highlights the arguments of Hanno, a prominent figure who had always opposed the Barca family's more aggressive policies. Hanno forcefully condemned what Hannibal did, saw the inevitable Roman reaction coming, and actually argued that Carthage should appease Rome by handing Hannibal over to them.
It's a pretty remarkable foresight, isn't it?
It really is. But Hanno's faction was ultimately overruled. Hannibal's supporters won the debate, and Carthage prepared for war. Meanwhile, Rome tried a bit of diplomacy, sending envoys to Gaul to try and secure alliances against Hannibal, figuring he might try to cross their territory. The source paints this vivid picture of the Roman ambassadors addressing a great council of Gauls, who were described as all armed and looking formidable. The Romans talked up their power, the inevitability of their victory, urging the Gauls to block Hannibal.
But the response was apparently blunt, even contemptuous. The Gauls basically shouted them down.
Yeah.
Their reply was clear. They'd had nothing but violence and injury from Rome historically, while Carthage had actually shown them kindness and goodwill. They had absolutely zero interest in helping Rome fight Hannibal.
So that pushed Hannibal's plan forward. He had to get to Italy. He left his brother, also named Hasdrubal, confusing, I know, in charge of their Spanish territories, left him with a significant force too, African infantry, cavalry, elephants, and even a small fleet of warships, quinqueremes. Those are ships with 5 banks of oars.
And then came the famous march, starting with that incredibly audacious crossing of the Rhone River. The source details the challenges, the strong, turbulent current. The soldiers had to learn boat building from the local Gauls on the fly and quickly resorted to just building improvised rafts.
It sounds like total chaos. Boats and rafts getting spun around in eddies, and then you've got hostile Gallic tribesmen lining the far bank, ready to attack with missiles and war cries as the Carthaginians tried to land.
But Hannibal, brilliant strategist that he was, had a flanking maneuver planned. He sent a detachment, led by a different Hanna, not the senator upstream, to cross quietly, circle around, and hit the Gauls on the far bank from behind.
And it worked.
Perfectly. Just as Hannibal started the main crossing, Hanno's troops attacked the Gauls from the rear with terrible impetuosity, as the source puts it. The Gauls, caught totally off guard between the landing force and this attack from behind, just broke and fled, left the riverbank wide open.
Clever. So after the Rhone, Hannibal made a key strategic choice. Instead of heading straight for the Alps by the most obvious route, he actually moved north along the Rhone for a bit.
Why do that?
Well, the source explains it was a deliberate move to avoid an early battle with the Roman general Scipio the Elder One, the father who was positioned further south. It gave Hannibal a better chance to reach the Alps via a less expected path.
Smart. And when Scipio got to the Rhone crossing point, he found Hannibal was gone. He learned Hannibal had headed north. Realizing pursuit in Gaul was probably pointless, and since Spain was technically his assigned province anyway, Scipio made a calculated gamble.
Which was?
He sent the bulk of his army on to Spain to deal with the forces Hannibal had left with his brother Hasdrubal. But Scipio himself sailed back to Italy with a smaller contingent, hoping to catch Hannibal as he came down from the Alps into northern Italy.
Ah, the famous Alps crossing. The source really does not sugarcoat it. It describes this dramatic contrast between the lower slopes, which were relatively easy with pastures and herds, and then the brutal, desolate, barren summits.
Yeah, the description of the weather is stark. Perpetual rain, violent storms, snow that completely wiped out any landmarks. The army, the animals, they suffered immensely from hunger and the cold. Just the sheer physical effort of getting that many men and animals over those mountains is staggering to think about.
There must have been just immense relief when they finally started coming down, moving through forests again, reaching those warmer, fertile plains of Italy. After everything they'd been through, they were finally there.
Hannibal had made it into Italy. But just as Scipio had guessed, the Roman general was already there, gathering forces in the north to meet him.
The first real clash in Italy was near the river Ticinus. And the source gets this fascinating detail about how Hannibal psyched up his troops before the battle.
Yeah.
He staged these brutal fights between prisoners he'd taken in the Alps, offered freedom, a horse, and armor to the winner. Apparently, seeing the desperation and ferocity of those fights and the prize, it really energized his own soldiers, got them fired up.
Huh. Interesting tactic. In stark contrast, the Roman soldiers were reportedly discouraged by bad omens, like a wolf wandering into their camp and a swarm of bees settling on Scipio's tent. It really shows you the influence of superstition on ancient armies.
Totally. The Battle of Ticinus itself seems to have started almost by accident, just a sudden clash between scouting parties. Hannibal attacked aggressively, and the Roman lines quickly got confused. The source notes that Scipio, the Roman commander, was wounded in the fight.
And here's another key moment for a character we'll see more of. Scipio's young son, who was only about 20 at the time, was fighting right there beside his father.
The future Scipio Africanus.
Exactly. The source tells us this young man protected his wounded father and helped him get back safely to the camp. Pretty heroic stuff.
Definitely. The Roman forces retreated overnight, showing that resolve again by destroying their bridge over the Ticinus River to slow Hannibal down.
Next up, the wounded Scipio was joined near the Trebia River by the other Roman consul, Sempronius, and the source points out the classic problem of having two commanders with equal authority.
Always tricky.
Yeah. And these two couldn't have been more different in their approach. Sempronius was described as impetuous, eager for a fight, wanted glory. The wounded Scipio, maybe wiser or just humbled by Ticinus, argued for delay, for caution. He was worried Sempronius was underestimating Hannibal.
Sounds like a recipe for disaster.
And it was. The Battle of Trebia was fought in brutal conditions, cold, rainy. The source describes a total Roman defeat. The remaining elephants caused significant havoc, and the retreat was chaotic, with many soldiers lost just trying to cross the swollen river.
So after these early wins, Hannibal wintered and then made another difficult march, crossing the Apennine Mountains into Etruria. The source describes another terrible passage, a 4-day trek through a marshy area in the Arno Valley.
The suffering sounds immense, difficult ground, exposure, hunger for both men and animals. Hannibal himself suffered too, riding the last surviving elephant. He contracted a severe eye infection during that crossing, which eventually cost him the sight in one eye, so even the great general wasn't immune to the brutal conditions.
Wow. Back in Rome, though, the news of these defeats, one after another, caused widespread panic. The source describes intense grief, this superstitious fear where every little thing was seen as a bad omen.
Yeah.
And there's this incredibly poignant, just heartbreaking detail about two mothers who apparently died from the sheer shock of joy when their sons returned safely after they'd already heard they were dead. It really brings home the human cost, beyond just the battlefield numbers.
Definitely. This period of crisis led the Roman Republic to appoint a dictator, Fabius Maximus. He's the one who implemented the famous strategy of avoiding direct battle with Hannibal, what we now call Fabian tactics.
Right, the idea was to harass Hannibal, cut off his supplies, wear him down slowly without risking another huge defeat like Trivia.
But this cautious approach was super unpopular in Rome. A lot of people saw it as cowardly. Political conflict flared up, leading to Fabius's second-in-command, Minucius, being granted equal authority. Minucius, eager to prove himself and probably pressured by the political mood, rushed into a battle.
And messed up.
Big time. He got into serious trouble. The source recounts how Fabius, even though he'd been politically undermined, had to rush in with his half of the army to rescue Minucius and his men from being completely wiped out.
Did Minucius learn his lesson?
To his credit, yes. He publicly acknowledged his mistake and deferred back to Fabius's leadership. The source also highlights Fabius's personal integrity. Apparently, he even sold his own farm at one point to pay a ransom for some prisoners when the Senate was dragging its feet.
But those Fabian tactics, they weren't really sustainable politically, were they?
No. After Fabius's term as dictator ended, the pressure for a decisive battle just kept mounting. A year later, the consuls elected were Aemilius Paulus, a cautious patrician, friend of Fabius and Varro, a more boastful plebeian type who was really eager for a quick, decisive victory. Varro apparently went around publicly promising to crush Hannibal the moment he laid eyes on him.
Uh-oh. That combination sounds dangerous.
It absolutely set the stage for the disaster at Cannae. The source does mention a minor skirmish victory for the Romans under Aemilius just before, and how Hannibal tried a feigned retreat trick that got foiled when some slaves escaped and revealed the plan.
But then Hannibal made a calculated move.
Right. He moved his army to Apulia, near the town of Cannae on the Alpheus River. The source notes he was drawn there partly by the ripening grain-needed supplies and by the open ground, which was perfect for his superior cavalry.
Cannae fought on just a massive scale. The source estimates maybe 50,000 men on Hannibal's side against, 80,000 Romans? The description of the battle itself is just horrific.
Yeah, and it includes this wild detail about prisoners who had been kept sort of within the Roman ranks, suddenly pulling out concealed daggers and attacking the Romans from the rear at a critical moment.
Seriously, wow.
The outcome was an utter, devastating Roman defeat, just catastrophic. The source describes Consul Aemilius receiving a mortal wound, hit by a sling stone. He sends a final message with an officer named Lentulus, tells him to flee, report the disaster back to Rome, and specifically tell Fabius that he, Aemilius, wasn't to blame for the disastrous strategy, basically pointing the finger at Varro.
And Aemilius died there.
Yeah, died right there on the battlefield. Varro, the boastful one, managed to escape.
And the scale of the loss.
Wow.
It's chillingly shown by that trophy Hannibal sent back to Carthage.
Yeah.
Bushels of gold rings collected from the fingers of the dead Roman knights and senators.
It's a powerful, grim image of the cost of that battle. The source suggests that a big reason Hannibal could stay in Italy for so long, winning these victories, was that for years Rome simply didn't have a general who could match his genius on the battlefield.
Until,
as we hinted earlier, that young man who saved his father at Ticinus really stepped up, the younger Scipio.
yes, the son of the general wounded at Ticinus. He becomes Scipio Africanus. The source says his later actions completely overshadowed his father's.
His character was clear right after Cannae. Rome was reeling, total panic, and some high-ranking officers were actually discussing abandoning Italy altogether. Scipio, described as just a youth then, bursts into their meeting, draws his sword, and basically forces them, one by one, to swear an oath of loyalty to Rome, confronted their despair head-on.
Wow. Quite a leader even then.
Absolutely. So while Scipio was rising through the ranks, Hannibal's brother, Hasdrubal, tried to bring those much-needed reinforcements from Spain to Italy. He followed a similar route over the Alps that Hannibal had taken years before.
Was the crossing easier this time?
Apparently somewhat less difficult, maybe because Hannibal has sort of paved the way, but Hasdrubal's attempts still ended in disaster. He was intercepted in northern Italy by a combined Roman force. His defeat was significantly helped by the rapid march and crucial arrival of another Roman general, Nero, coming up from the south.
And Hasdrubal realized things were bad.
The source says Hasdrubal realized from the makeup of the Roman army facing him, seeing troops from the south, that his brother, Hannibal, must have suffered a major defeat or setback down there. His own army was routed and destroyed in the battle that followed.
And then came that gruesome message.
Yeah. The brutal, unforgettable detail. The Romans cut off Hasdrubal's head after the battle, and in a horrific psychological blow, literally threw it into Hannibal's camp.
Just unimaginable.
So with Hannibal now isolated and the tide slowly turning in Italy, Scipio gets elected consul, one of the two top magistrates in Rome. He's given Sicily as his province, but crucially, with permission to take the war to Africa. The other consul stayed in Italy to keep pinning Hannibal down.
Scipio's strategy was clear then. Don't just fight Hannibal where he is, take the fight to Carthage's home turf.
Exactly. Brilliant, really. By threatening their homeland directly, he could force the Carthaginians to recall Hannibal from Italy to defend Carthage itself.
And it worked.
Perfectly. Facing Scipio's pressure in Africa, the Carthaginians agreed to negotiate peace terms. Though the source notes they primarily agreed to Scipio's very harsh demands just to buy time to get Hannibal back, they still pinned immense hope on him saving them.
And those terms were harsh.
Right. Devastating. Carthage lost all their overseas possessions, including Spain. They only kept limited territory in Africa. Their navy was slashed down to just 10 small ships. They had to surrender the rest. They had to give up all their war elephants and were forbidden from ever training more. They couldn't make war outside Africa and even needed Roman permission for war within Africa. Plus, they had to pay this massive annual tribute to Rome for 50 years. It was designed to completely cripple them.
Wow. Total submission, basically.
Pretty much. And the source mentions Scipio's striking decision not to actually take the huge surrendered Carthaginian fleet, but instead to burn it right there near Carthage.
Why do that?
Well, maybe Rome lacked the sailors to effectively crew all those ships. Or maybe it was just for the sheer symbolic impact, destroying their naval power right in front of their eyes.
Scipio returns to Rome a hero.
A conquering hero. The population saw him as their great deliverer. He got a massive, triumphant welcome and was given that unique honor, the name Africanus, signifying his conquest of, well, Africa, or at least their main rival there.
The source also touches on the politics back in Carthage after the defeat. It notes that the party that had always opposed Hannibal, led by figures like Hanno, they gained power.
Right.
And their later actions, which history sometimes sees as abandoning Hannibal or being ungrateful, the source suggests it was actually pretty consistent with their long-held views and their own factional interests, not necessarily just simple ingratitude.
Interesting perspective. And what about Hannibal himself? Despite this crushing defeat at home, his spirit apparently wasn't broken. The source describes him seeking new alliances after the war, like with Antiochus, king of the Seleucid Empire. Still plotting, still planning against Rome. He even proposed raising a naval force to maybe retake Carthage and invade Italy again.
Never gave up. There's that clever story about him, too, protecting his money while he was in exile in Crete.
Oh yeah, the treasure story. Fearing the Cretans, who were apparently known for being greedy, would steal his gold, he filled these large earthenware jars, mostly with lead, but put a layer of gold and silver coins on top.
Wow.
Then he deposited these jars in a temple with great ceremony, like it was his whole fortune, making sure everyone saw. Meanwhile, he hid his real gold inside hollow bronze statues, which the Cretans just dismissed as, worthless art objects.
A final flash of that Carthaginian cunning.
Exactly. The source then briefly touches on later events that would ultimately seal Carthage's fate. It mentions a conflict involving the Numidian king Massinissa and a Carthaginian general. A different Hasdrubal this time, not Hannibal's brother. Scipio Africanus himself was asked to mediate. Scipio proposed terms involving territory and money, but this Carthaginian Hasdrubal refused, leading to a siege. It shows Carthage was still kind of pushing the boundaries of the treaty regarding war in Africa.
And this leads more or less to the final Roman push against Carthage.
Implicitly, yes. The source mentions Carthage violating the treaty again regarding war in Africa. And Rome's response this time was chillingly cold. Carthaginian envoys came seeking some kind of satisfaction or mediation, but Rome just turned it back on them, demanded satisfaction from Carthage, and deliberately left the future status and security of Carthage completely ambiguous. Very ominous.
And one of the cruelest Roman demands leading up to that final war was the hostage system.
Ugh, yes. Requiring 300 youths from the leading Carthaginian families to be sent away, first to Sicily, then to Rome. The source describes these utterly heartbreaking scenes of separation, the suffering of the families, especially the mothers, forced to send their children into exile, into potential danger.
Horrible. And the
Mhm.
source kind of concludes with this stark general description of the final assault on a populous city, just capturing the brutal chaos, the terrifying shouts, the screams of the innocent, the groans of the dying, a really visceral reminder of the ultimate price paid in this long conflict.
And finally, the source pulls back and offers this larger philosophical point. It talks about war and commerce as these fundamentally opposing principles. Commerce, it argues, builds and preserves society. It creates cities, cultivates fields, brings comfort, establishes order, helps humanity fight things like pestilence and famine.
While war, which it calls the great enemy of humanity, just tears everything down, destroys the social fabric, ruins cities and fields, causes idleness and want, and actually enables pestilence and famine to take hold. It frames it really clearly. Commerce as the great friend, war as the great enemy of humankind.
And these two principles, one focused on building and prosperity, the other on destruction and conquest, according to the source, they are constantly vying for dominance, not just between Rome and Carthage, but within all human societies, really.
So wrapping up this deep dive then, we've seen the epic scale of the Punic Wars, those fundamental differences in character between Rome and Carthage, the sheer military brilliance and, frankly, audacity of Hannibal. The rise of Scipio as the Roman counterpoint, and ultimately the absolutely devastating consequences for Carthage.
Yeah, getting into these sources really does give you that layered understanding, doesn't it? You move beyond just the basic story to appreciate the strategic thinking, the political backstabbing, the incredible personalities, the sheer human suffering, and even those little surprising details that make the past feel so much more real.
It really makes you think, though, doesn't it, about that fundamental tension the source identifies between building and trading, seeking prosperity through connection commerce versus conquest and destruction war. How much of that same tension, that same dynamic is still playing out across the world today?
Or maybe consider the long shadow that historical grievances can cast. How the weight of old grudges, like those between Rome and Carthage, can keep driving events and shaping the future, potentially leading to conflict long, long after the original spark has faded. Definitely something to keep pondering long after we finish this deep dive.